Deco Network's content management system revolves around using drag and drop, what you see is what you get editing tools. And essentially, what a website is just a series of pages full of content. And content in Deco's eyes is in the form of a widget. So at its core, we select a page to edit. Right now we're on the home page, and we'll just stay here. We come into our widgets and we choose the type of content we want to drag and drop onto the page. If I want to add, really anything you can imagine, let's just add a video. And then we've got a link to YouTube or Vimeo to actually insert the link here and display it. So it's all about just choosing your type of content to get on the page and then edit the content's look by using the widgets settings. Now, before we go into details about how the widgets work, we need to talk about rows. So let's just go to a random website. Let's go to apple.com. That's a good, there we go, we're already on it. So every website there is essentially is a series of rows of content. So if you're looking at this, right now this is one row. This is a row. Then we have a new section. It's a row, 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 row. Rows are broken into columns, or essentially sections. So this is one, this is one, this is one, this is two. I can see, not necessarily because of the line, but the content is broken up here and here. And I bet if we got on a phone, this would be underneath this. This would be underneath that. So these are all two columns. Let's just choose a random other page. Just go learn about a Mac. One column, one row. Actually, no, this is one row, two columns. Image over here, text over here. Another row, two columns. Two columns. Three columns. Two. I think you're getting it. Essentially, we just have rows, and within each row we have columns. Virtually every website is this way now. So when we come over to widgets, before we add any content, we need to add a row/column. So come over here to row column, drag it onto the page, and essentially you've added your row. Once you've added a row, you need to determine how many columns, or essentially containers, are within that row. So I'm going to come into the row settings, and I'm going to say, okay, we have 3 columns. And now you can see that we have 3 sections where we can put content in. So if now I want to drag and drop, let's just do an image over here, I absolutely can. It doesn't go across because I put it in just that one column. Within the rows settings, we have a lot of similar editing capabilities as a widget. So the row settings allows us to determine how many columns are we going to have. Second, we have the background properties. So it's common to have a background image behind your content. For example, with what Apple was doing here with the home page, this is a background image. So if we were to kind of recreate this, let's go back to our row settings. Let's just make it 1. Now, a very important rule to understand. What they were doing here is they have, this is a background image and then text over top of it. We cannot put a widget over a widget. So right now I have this image widget. I cannot come to text or heading and put it on top of this. It literally has to be on top. It won't be on it. So if you ever want to put something over something, you really need to be using the background image of a row. So within this row, I could add it here, or again, let's come back to the row settings, background properties, background, and here I can add a color. Just do black, for example. Or, let me undo that. I can upload an image. So let's just upload an image, just like the one I had before. And there it is. So now I've added the background image, and if I want to put something over it, like a button or a heading, I absolutely can. So if you're going to put something over something, it pretty much has to be a background image. So these background properties, they're used a lot. You're going to be using a lot of images, often as banners, used throughout the site. So these background properties, they are actually the exact same for every widget. For example, let's just come down, let's add a, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of a good piece of content here. Just a heading, actually just a line of text. This line of text technically has the same background properties as the row. So it's nothing new to learn. It's this, I can put a color, I can put an image behind it, but it's often a better idea to do it as a row, because now I can put more in this. I mean, it just, you kind of have to, you'll naturally see. The background properties though. So when I have this image here, if you're looking at it, it's not exactly the sharpest. And the reason why is it's not the right size yet. And this is a big question that a lot of people have. How big is a banner supposed to be? Well, first of all, it should be high resolution, meaning we're 300 dpi or higher. So if this is going to be 300 dpi, how many total pixels should it be? Because right now this says 1000 in width. You really want to be around 2,000 to 3,000 pixels. So if you're at 300 dpi and you make it 10 inches wide, you will naturally get to where you want to be. So what does all that mean? Well, let's just come to my desktop. Oh gosh, I don't have anything good here. Let's just grab this random screenshot, drag it into Photoshop. So if I want this to be a banner, and obviously not a good one, I would come into my image, size. This needs to be 300 dpi, and I should be around 10 inches wide. That makes it 3,000 pixels in width by whatever height that it is. So essentially, if you're going to upload something and you want it to be a full banner width, definitely again, image size 300 dpi, 10 inches in width becomes 3,000 pixels. Whenever we upload an image, make sure that you size it. Make sure that it's sized to be around that 2,000 to 3,000. So I'm going to change this to huge. Watch how much sharper the image gets. Definitely sharper. You can add a scroll effect if you would like. You can choose the image position. You can come into the image and the hover effects, which we'll go over more detail in other videos. You can add a border or a shadow. The background properties, again, is one of the more often used parts of a row. The layout is, again, similar to the way it works for a widget. This allows us to set the spacing, the margin, and the padding. So the spacing would be if we have multiple columns. So this is still one row, one column. Let's change this to 2 columns. Okay, so I can have 2 columns here. I've got my text here, it's just black, so let's just make it easier to read. White. Okay, and then over here, let's just add a button, for example. That's all I need. Now, if we come into the layout properties, the spacing is the space between the columns. Now, because we're not really that close, you're not going to see that big of a difference. Let me just make this button much bigger, for example. And let's align this to the right. Now if I change the rows spacing, so never use any of these actual names, always use custom. It shouldn't even be an option, but just use custom. And I can change this, for example, to 25. You see how the space increases here? Watch when I do it even more. Spacing for a row is the amount of space in between columns. And this is important because when we stack, when I get down to a phone, for example, this is underneath this, and the distance that there really separates them is the spacing. So if I come back to the layout, I can change the spacing for this device. Let me make it 10. You see how much closer it becomes? Make it 100, much bigger. So the spacing is used throughout all the different devices. It ends up being the gap between the top and the bottom, more or less. Also within the layout are margin and padding. Padding is the space inside of the green. So you see right now it says 108 padding, which is right here. If I make this 20, see the gap changes, I make it 220, gets bigger. That's the space in between. Let's just make it back to 100. The margin is the space outside. And just like the spacing, we want to never use these different settings. We want to use custom. So on the bottom here, I'm going to set it to custom and watch the gap change here. Okay, so that's the gap outside of the green. Very important to understand this, and again, we'll go over it more detailed later. Lastly, we have the stretch for the row. You can see how the content isn't, the background here isn't going all the way across. So within stretch, I could go background full page bleed, and it goes all the way across. It is rare that you want to use content full page bleed. Background full page bleed, you can get away with more. Content, you're potentially setting yourself up for headache. Next, we have the responsive properties. The responsive properties are going to allow us to set the way that essentially these columns act on different devices. So you can see we have a 2-column row, and for every device but the phone, we're going to leave it inline, meaning we're not stacking it. Let's change this, for example, to let's do a 6, just for fun. So we have 6 columns here, and let's just, you know what, let's just clone this button, for example. And clone it again. Clone it again. One more time. Okay, so what we can decide with the row settings, responsive properties, what are we going to do on each type of device? So when I get down to a smaller monitor, we essentially just pushed them in. That works. When we get down to a tablet, it's a smaller screen. Now we can keep pushing it in, but we also can, let's try the semi-stacked. So now we are 2 rows of 3. Looks nicer. On the phone, it just did a straight up stack. Instead of just doing the straight up stack, let's try to do the semi-stacked, and this is 3 rows of 2. So this is essentially how we're determining, how we're making it responsive. It's automatically making decisions for us, but we will get better results when we take control over the responsive properties and override some decisions. Lastly, we have the advanced section of the row. This is rarely going to be used. It takes some custom coding understanding to even play with this whatsoever, so I would not worry about it. Primarily, we add a row, we determine how many columns it has, we might add a background image. It's important that you make sure that that image is around 2,000 to 3,000 pixels in width if you're going to use it as a full width banner. One thing with the image effects that I'm just going to show real quick, I can turn down the brightness if I'm going to overlay text over it. So I'm going to turn the brightness down, for example, to 50. And now you can see the picture got darker, but I still know what it is, but I can read, the heading and everything else better. The layout is very important. The spacing determines how much gap is in between the columns. The margin determines how much space is outside of the green. You really always want to use custom. Padding is the space inside of the green. So how much space, and if I can manually drag this, and you'll see that the bottom and the top are changing right now. The stretch determines if we want things to be the full width of the page. Monitors come in a lot of different sizes. So background, you can get away with more. Content, you could set yourself up for some headaches. And lastly, sorry, this kind of went off the page. The responsive properties is where we're going to determine the way that the rows stacked and look on the different types of devices. So again, before we start adding widgets or content, you must set up your row to be the way you want it to look. The containers are very important. A big tip that I have for you is if you're going to do a 4-row container, when you have 4 columns in a row, when you get down to a tablet, you cannot stack them into 2 rows of 2. See how it's inline, it's semi-stacked, or it's stacked. So if you are going to do a 4-column row, which are very common, you're better off doing, let me just make this 2 columns. Okay, actually I'm sorry to make that 2 columns, and then drag a 2-column row on one of them. Let me just drag this into the left, drag this into the right, and then clone it. So doing a row of 2 columns with 2 more columns now gives me more flexibility. When I get down to like the tablet, I can stack them. So it's a good idea to essentially put rows within rows to give yourself more control instead of just having one row with a ton of columns. Hopefully you find this video helpful. If you have any questions on how Deco Network's content management system works, please don't hesitate contacting us. Thank you.